Here he comes. So I've been assured that the microphone is on. If you can't hear, I would recommend that you come up just a little closer. We're currently running on house speakers here on either side of our media screen because we had a couple of amps burn out this week. We're waiting for them to bring replacements. Normally the sound comes out of these speakers here, but right now the sound is coming from here. But if you can all hear me, then we'll be fine. Can you hear me? You can't hear me? Okay, that's what I was worried about. Vin, is there any way to make this louder? I can speak louder, but I could I get my son to do it. He does ASL. Let's see if we can get the volume up a bit. Can we maybe move forward if you can? So is this the highest volume that the? Okay. Well, I will speak more loudly in hopes that you'll be able to hear me at the back. Good evening. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this year's Nikirk lecture. In his late poem, The Municipal Gallery Revisited, William Butler Yeats wrote, "Time may bring approved patterns of women or of men, but not that self-same excellence again." His poem remembers and honors those whose pioneering work laid the foundations for the present, or, as he writes in another poem, provided the right twigs for an eagle's nest. Before introducing this evening's speaker, I would like to pause and pay tribute to two remarkable men whose vision and dedication continue to shape the life of our club today. This special program was established in memory of one of my distinguished predecessors, Robert Nikirk, who served as the club's librarian from 1970 until his untimely death in 1990. In those days, as many of our long-standing members will recall, the librarian was also the de facto director. Though I never had the privilege of meeting Bob Nikirk, he was far more than librarian and director. He was a scholar, a graceful and creative writer, and a man deeply devoted to the decorative arts. This lecture series was inaugurated in Robert Nikirk's honor through the generosity of one of our club's most illustrious members, Charles Tannenbaum. Charles joined the club in 1969 and served with dedication on the council. He was secretary from 1978 to 1982 and contributed his expertise to the Committee on Public Exhibitions, the Committee on Member Exhibitions, and the Library Committee. Few members have been as engaged in the life of the club as Charles, and his commitment was recognized when he was elected an honorary member in 2002. I was privileged to be at the annual meeting when Charles's honorary membership was conferred, and I recall his pride and his humility in that moment. We remember him today as a great bookman and an exemplar of our shared values. It is thanks to Charles Tannenbaum's philanthropic vision that we gather here tonight. I would like to also take a moment to express my gratitude to Sylvia Tannenbaum, who's here with us, for sustaining Charles's generosity and vision through her steadfast support of the club. The Pine Tree Foundation continues to fund the club's archivist and this annual lecture, and Sylvia has provided additional support for the marvelous exhibition that surrounds us this evening. Thank you, Sylvia. It's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Joseph Hone, a leading scholar of 18th century literature and political culture. Dr. Hone is reader in literature and book history at Newcastle University. Through his published works on illicit and duplicitous printing, seditious libel, forgery, and theft, Dr. Hone has established himself as one of the most dynamic early voices in the field, combining rigorous archival scholarship with a gift for lucid, engaging storytelling. His work consistently illuminates the ways in which books, authorship, and political power intersected in the long 18th century. In 2014, Joe was the Catherine F. Pantzer Fellow in Distinguished Bibliography at Harvard, and in 2018 was awarded the James M. Osborne Fellowship in English Literature and History at Yale. In 2022, he was awarded the Philip Leverhulme Prize for work in literary studies and book history. Dr. Hone is currently a fellow at All Souls, Oxford. He's the author of several acclaimed books, including Alexander Pope in the Making, published by Oxford University Press in 2021, and praised for its fresh archival discoveries and its revelatory portrait of Pope's early career, and The Book Forger, published last year. His essays and articles appear in major scholarly journals, and he is a frequent contributor to public literary culture through his essays in the library, papers of the Bibliographical Society of America, the Review of English Studies, the Library, and History Today, to name but a select few. I bought a copy of The Book Forger just before a family trip to Spain in the summer of 2024. When I succumbed to COVID and was banished to the other side of the swimming pool, Joe and TJ Wise were my sole companions, and I have to confess, I didn't mind it at all. I mean it as the highest compliment when I say that The Book Forger is written with such verve and narrative pace that it holds its own against any beach reading. As soon as I returned from that trip and started this job, I wrote to Joe and beseeched him to come and speak here at the club, and he kindly agreed just over a year ago to come here tonight and give this year's Nikirk lecture. Dr. Hone's work resonates strongly with bibliophiles and historians of the book. He reminds us that textual scholarship, whether uncovering biographical and bibliographical networks around Pope or disentangling the webs of forgery and authorship spun by T.J. Wise, remains a lively and investigative art. Please welcome me in join me in welcoming, I should say, Dr. Joseph Hone. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Declan, for that kind introduction. And thank you to the Pine Tree Foundation for making this evening possible, and of course, to the ladies and gentlemen of the club for your hospitality this evening. It's a tremendous, let us be frank, scandalously undeserved honour to have been invited to give this year's Nikirk lecture. I must confess that when Declan invited me this evening, to feeling rather like a common tabby cat mistaken for a tiger. But I suppose the least I can do is purr my gratitude, and so I say once again, thank you, Declan, and thank you, everybody. I would like to open my remarks this evening by transporting us across an ocean and back 160 plus years to the start of Michaelmas term 1862 in Cambridge. Undergraduates are starting to filter back into town. It's one of those glorious October evenings when anything feels possible. Currently residing at Christ's College is the Greek manuscript scholar and notorious forger Constantine Simonides. Here he is. Can we go? Yes, there he is. Right, there he is on the right, looking characteristically Mephistophelian. On this particular evening, he has invited a select group of Cambridge scholars to his room at Christ's to examine his personal collection of papyri and discuss an explosive claim that he's just aired in the pages of the Manchester Guardian, that the 4th century Codex Sinaiticus, recently discovered in the ancient monastery in the foothills of Mount Sinai, and which has a very strong claim to be the oldest surviving text of the New Testament, had in fact been made only a few decades earlier by him. Among the doubters whom Simonides invited that evening was a young Henry Bradshaw, here on the left. Yes, my right, sorry. We're going to get lefts and rights confused this evening. That's just how it is. I'm jet-lagged. Just that same year, Bradshaw had developed the system of collational formulae that, modified by Gregg and Bowers, remains in use today. Around this time, he was making truly foundational contributions within codicology, typographic analysis, and towards an understanding of compositorial habits. He was also a student of early manuscripts, and, crucially, one of very few scholars to actually have inspected the Codex Sinaiticus since its arrival in Europe. Bradshaw had expressed grave doubts about Simonides' claim to have forged this manuscript. In his view, it could only be genuine. So now it was the Greek's turn to restate his case. The great question around which this evening came to orbit was simple. How do you satisfy yourself of the genuineness of any manuscript? Asked Simonides. I first replied that it was really difficult to define, writes Bradshaw in his account of the discussion. Quote, that it seemed to be more a kind of instinct than anything else. Dr. Simonides and his friends readily caught this as too much like vague assertion, and they naturally ridiculed any such idea. But I further said that I'd lived for 6 years past in the constant, almost daily habit of examining manuscripts, not merely the texts of the works contained in the volumes, but the volumes themselves as such. The writing, the paper or parchment, the arrangement or numbering of the sheets, the distinction between the original volume and additional material by later hands. And with experience of this kind, though it might be difficult to assign the special ground of my confidence, yet I hardly ever found myself deceived, even by a very well-executed facsimile. All this, Dr. Simonides allowed and confirmed. He gave the instance of the Jews in the East who could, in an instant, tell the exact proportion of foreign matter in a bottle of otto of roses, where the most careful chemical analysis might fail to detect the same. Indeed, any tradesman acquires the same sort of experience with regard to the quality of the particular goods which are daily passing through his hands, and this is all that I claimed for myself. Well, Henry Bradshaw has been assessed as possessing one of the most astute bibliographical minds of all time. He was a master of technique, establishing what Paul Needham has termed the Bradshaw method, but what Bradshaw himself described as the natural history method of studying books, grounded in recent advances in what would now be called the biological sciences, in particular by his Cambridge contemporary Charles Darwin. More recently, Richard Beadle has shown that Bradshaw's was also a self-consciously forensic method, heavily inspired by contemporary police work, which, as I've suggested in an essay published earlier this year in PBSA, had by the middle of the 19th century developed sophisticated methods of print and paper examination. And yet, for all his advocacy of technical analysis, when asked by Simonides how he came to determine the authenticity of manuscripts, Bradshaw did not talk about the writing substrate, or the ink, or the structure of the codex. He did not mention the form of the lettering, or its arrangement on the page. He talked instead about instinct, about how the book made him feel. Nor was this an inexplicable blip brought on by the sulphurous atmosphere of Simonides' digs. No, in his published writing, Bradshaw repeatedly talks about the cultivated instinct of bibliography. Quote, "It is only when anyone has made a daily study of such books for many months together and has become, so to say, thoroughly soaked with their characteristics, that one can hope to gain that instinct, which is of such infinite value afterwards, when fresh books come under one's eye and resemblances and relationships of handwriting and style are forced on him. in a way that could never result from a more casual and less intimate acquaintance. He praises the, quote, bibliographical instinct and well-trained eye of the Belgian librarian Ferdinand van der Hagen, which he felt would enable him or anyone who followed his lead to solve all manner of difficulties in a very short space of time. So, the career of Henry Bradshaw thus furnishes us with two starkly different ways of looking at books. One of them forensic, quasi-scientific, you might say, in its aspirations and methods of analysis, but the other instinctual, tacit, almost indefinable. By way of shorthand, I refer to these alternative approaches as those of the microscope and the eye. It seems to me that over the last 100 years, one of these approaches has come to dominate over the other in the field of bibliography. And the results of this methodological dominance have, admittedly, been spectacular. As a direct result of bibliography's commitment to technique, refining established methods of analysis, developing new methods of analysis, we now know far more about who printed what, when, where, and how than Bradshaw or any of his contemporaries could ever have thought possible. Chemical analysis, the burgeoning field of biocodicology, these are now enabling previously unfathomable insights into the material composition of books and manuscripts and the human role in making them. My aim this evening, though, is to suggest that we've also lost something in the bargain. As the great Italian historian Carlo Ginzburg proclaimed in a celebrated essay on clues, nobody learns how to be a connoisseur or a diagnostician simply by applying the rules. With this kind of knowledge, there are factors in play which cannot be measured: a whiff, a glance, an intuition. I believe that collectively, we've forgotten that many of the major technical breakthroughs in the field of bibliography were themselves inspired by such whiffs, glances, intuitions. W. Gregg's pioneering watermark analysis of the so-called Pavia quartos was inspired, in his own words, by happy inspiration, a vague sense that there was, quote, something phony about certain 19th century pamphlets led to Carter and Pollard's expose of the Wise forgeries in 1934, corroborating their instincts by applying techniques of chemical analysis to paper. You can go on and on. Alan Stevenson's celebrated examination of the Missal Speciale was prompted by a suspicion, his word, that something might have been overlooked in the paper evidence. So my aim this evening is to make the case for the cultivation of instinct as a meaningful element of bibliographical inquiry, but never in isolation. Rather, what I want to try and illustrate is something that Bradshaw simply took for granted, but which I fear seems slightly less obvious to us now. That these two approaches are not irreconcilable alternatives, but necessary correlatives. They are two sides of the same coin. Just as technique without taste lapses into empty ritual, so the microscope without the well-trained eye is a mere toy. The resulting approach might fruitfully be thought of as the connoisseurship of books. The notion of connoisseurship, though not, I think, its practice, has become deeply unfashionable in the world of art history. At a 2014 event on the future of connoisseurship, sponsored by the Mellon Foundation, a senior British Museum curator was overheard declaring, "I would rather gouge my eyes out with a rusty penknife than describe myself as a connoisseur." The word conjures the worst varieties of dilettantism, the kinds of hazy judgment and rank amateurism that W. Gregg denounced in his presidential address to the Bibliographical Society in 1930, when he declared triumphantly that, quote, the amateur and the dilettante are giving place to the expert and the scholar. But such modern associations, I think, are singularly unhelpful, for they obscure the degree to which, in Bradshaw's lifetime, connoisseurship came to be the hallmark of a newly professionalized study of art. The key figure in that story was the Italian critic Giovanni Morelli. Although I've not quite been able to prove that Bradshaw and Morelli's paths ever crossed, I would be immensely surprised if they did not. They were certainly fellow travelers. They toured the same European sales rooms each season and held several close friends in common, most notably the energetic young collector William Martin Conway, who at different times described himself as the protege of each man. In any event, it often happens that two people independently hit upon the same idea in any given time, some indefinable quality in the air that sparks identical synapses to connect. And indeed, perhaps that's what happened here. For there are real parallels in thought between Bradshaw and Morelli that I think help to illuminate what Bradshaw meant when he talked about instinct. In his 1880 manifesto on method, Morelli, in the voice of a naive interlocutor, and in a series of gleefully venomous dialogues, sticks the knife into the art establishment of 19th century Europe. Quote, they would tell you, they being critics, that he whom nature was destined for a true art historian or critic need not think of troubling himself about the details upon which you lay so much stress. In his eyes, it would be a sheer waste of time. It would simply deaden his intellect to do so. The general impression produced upon him by a work of art, be it a picture or a statue, is quite sufficient to enable him to recognize the master at the first glance. And beyond this general impression and tradition, he needs only the testimony of a written document to arrive at complete certainty as to its author. Morelli's core doctrine, by contrast with that voice, was that the inborn feeling, that's a Morelli line, that his contemporaries cherished as divine gift, quote, will not suffice for the science of art unless trained and developed by a study of the works of art themselves. Only through a coordinated program of study and practice might such critical impressionism become well-founded intuition. And even then, it needed to be backed up by a proper understanding of the specific attributes and characteristics of different artists, which could be gained only by spending many years studying the minutiae of thousands of paintings by hundreds of artists and their pupils and their followers. Morelli, like Bradshaw, was keen to distinguish between supposed innate talent and sheer bloody hard work. There is another fabulous Morelli line. There is no need for anyone to climb the mountain who has neither inclination nor capacity for the task. Let him stay at its foot in idle luxuriousness and jeer at those who are toiling upwards if he will. Well, it seems to me that this distinction between mere impressionism and cultivated intuition, born of experience, explains much of the confusion that has colored debates about the role of connoisseurship in the study of the arts. One of the more perceptive entrants into those debates, the great Harvard art historian Sidney J. Friedberg, put it rather nicely in a lecture some 35 years ago, commemorating the centenary of Bernard Berenson's arrival in Italy. Quote, above all, it needs to be stressed that connoisseurship is not a product of that unfathomable, non-rational and animal-seeming thing that is called intuition. Intuition is no more than the shorthand process, computer-like in its swiftness, with which the most expert connoisseur acquires and enters data into his mental bank of remembered similes, then compares, analyzes, and arrives at a solution. This, I think, is what Bradshaw means when he talks about the role of instinct in bibliography. There's no magic here. Simonides understood that when he compared Bradshaw's refined sensitivities to those of perfume merchants in the Holy Land, who did not possess supernaturally gifted olfactory nerves, but simply lived lives saturated by perfume. While having coffee recently with a good friend in the upstairs members' cafe at the British Library, I shared a rough sketch of my ideas for this lecture. And when I started prattling about Bradshaw's account of bibliographical instinct, the first thing that leapt into his head was Roger Federer's forehand. His ability seemingly to know where the ball would be before his opponent had struck it. That is the first time you've had Wimbledon live broadcast. To position his feet, to charge, to lunge, to strike with such precision, all in the moment that it would take an ordinary mortal to blink an eye or lick his lips. We're talking here about the cultivation of what modern cognitive scientists call the adaptive unconscious, that part of the brain that, in order to keep us alive, enables rapid-fire decision-making based on all our encounters and experiences in and with the world. It's a hell of a rally. Bradshaw's work with manuscripts and incunables, okay, perhaps this is a slightly different world in terms of glamour and athleticism to Centicord, but the mental gymnastics are, I believe, fundamentally the same. And a similar comparison, I think, could probably be made to any professional sports person, whether a trained fighter or a yachtsman who can sense an impending turn in the weather from the pressure in his ears. John Carter made a very similar, albeit characteristically waggish, statement in his 1947 Sanders Lectures. An engineer who can tell a sound casting from a flawed one, a soldier who can tell a sniper from a tree stump, a housewife who can tell undercut from scrag end, all are connoisseurs, in that they apply some degree of skill, born of precept and observation, to a given problem in their own field. In a precisely similar sense, and with no affectation whatsoever, does a man, sick, distinguish with a preference for the best and experience as his guide a vintage port from a non-vintage, a Rembrandt from a Boll, or a pristine copy of Pride and Prejudice in the original boards from a rebound copy without half titles. It's a marvellous piece of mock heroic there, going from Scraghend to Pride and Prejudice in the original boards. The important point here, though, is that Bradshaw's instincts, like those of Federer or Carter's engineer, soldier, or housewife, were the product of experience and judgment, not their precursor. To return to Friedberg's point, Bradshaw's connoisseurship was not based on his instincts. His instincts were based on his connoisseurship. At the same time, it is important not to confuse instinct for evidence. Allow me to indulge in a personal example. About 10 years ago, while trawling through early 18th century playbooks in the rare books room of the British Library, I came upon what I then believed was a small puzzle. Large numbers of these play duodecimos were bound together in contemporary sammelband. Others bore traces of having previously been grouped together, but since disbound. We're talking about play texts by people like Addison, Cibber, Lillo, Otway, Rowe, Steele, all with seemingly legitimate imprints to a publisher called William Fields, dated 1735 or thereabouts. But a few of these playbooks were obvious piracies, with bungled imprints or bogus dates that were either much too early or much too late. Now, the obvious explanation here would simply be that we've got several collections of remaindered plays, perhaps purchased at a discount when Fields filed for bankruptcy in 1737, later bound up with piracies that were specially produced to fill the gaps in those collections. But I could not shake the feeling that all these playbooks had being printed more or less at the same time. But it took me almost 10 years to work out why I thought this. One clue was that the same ornaments just kept popping up across playbooks, bearing very different dates, but with no obvious wear or tear. And more significantly, across those that seemed to be legitimate and those that were obvious piracies, as though they'd all come from the same press. With hindsight, and despite the variation in dates, most of the books appear to be printed on the same stock of paper. Now, I say appear, that's because I'm not David van der Meulen. More's the pity, some of you will be thinking. And while I will have a go at measuring chain and wire lines in quarto, I'll even have a go and do it in octavo. I will not do it in duodecimo. My patience is far too thin. And moreover, several of these Sammelband, the pamphlets appear to have been bound in boards without first being individually stitched for sale as separates. So in other words, I could tell that these volumes appeared to be collections rather than job lots of remainders. Now, I chalked this one down as a puzzle and moved on. Looking back on my notebook from 2017, I see that I added a question mark to the 1735 dates and a laconic single-word commentary. Piracy? And then I forgot about it. Years go by. In 2024, alongside my excellent PhD student, Sam Bailey, I began investigating what I then believed to be a completely unrelated mystery. The year 1 million edition of that most notorious example of English bawdy, Sodom, the sole extant copy of which was sold by Sotheby's in 2004. Now, through ornament analysis, we were able to prove beyond question that this book was printed by the down-and-out London pornographer John Leake, and that it was printed not in the 1720s, as Sotheby's thought, but in the 1740s. Now, only later, after the first draft of our investigation was complete and out for review, did I realize that the same ornament on the title page of Sodom also appeared on several of those playbooks that I'd previously flagged as suspicious. And here's where things get really interesting, because in several of the playbooks dated 1735, there is obvious damage to the block, whereas in the other books dated between 41 and 44, there is none. Now, I needn't labor the point, but this is a logical impossibility. To be sure, cracks in blocks, they can expand and contract based on fluctuations in temperature and humidity, but once open, they do not close entirely. My early hunch was correct. All those playbooks were backdated piracies, printed in the later 1740s with 1730s imprints. The final indication came in the form of John Leake's will, proved in 1751, where he bequeathed sums to be, quote, raised as soon as conveniently may be by the sale of part of my stock of plays, now deposited in the warehouse. John Leake, in the final chapter of his career, had turned from pornography to piracy. All's well that ends well. And at first glance, this is a happy tale of suspicions confirmed. It is not. The point I wish to make is that without the microscopic methods of analytical bibliography, my suspicions would have remained vague and unverified, mere jottings in an old moleskin notebook rather than empirical findings that can contribute to our knowledge of the past. It's only through method that intuition can become hypothesis, and hypothesis become fact. And yet, at the same time, without a degree of bibliographical instinct, without an eye for books, let's go back to those suspicions would never have been roused in the first place. The dangers of relying on instinct are thus twofold. Firstly, it can introduce a degree of complacency, preventing us from reaching the sort of empirical conclusions which sober methodical analysis makes possible. Secondly, and perhaps more worryingly, it can lead us astray. I think we're often too eager to place our trust in method, even when such methods are misconceived or poorly executed. I will be brief with this, but consider the debacle surrounding the forged Siderius Nuncius, purchased 20 years ago in this very city, just a few blocks away. You'll be pleased that this is not something I wish to relitigate. I see zero point in flogging dead horses. I also worry this particular horse may not be entirely dead. The point I do wish to make, however, is that a team of researchers, respected professionals, devoted more than 250 pages of seemingly dense technical analysis to proving the authenticity of this book. There are chapters exploring not only expected topics, such as bibliographical structure and watermark distribution, but also the chemical composition of ink and paper. The methods deployed range from, quote, three-dimensional confocal microscopy to, quote, ultraviolet and infrared refractography, quote, micro X-ray fluorescence spectrometry, and so on. This is, by any standard, highly technical work. And yet none of it was sufficient to recognize something was blindingly obvious to Nick Wilding, even working from photographs. Now, I'd like to say this is a rare blip, that unswerving commitment to method is more likely to open eyes than close them. Alas, no. For the same thing happened 50 years ago. Again, something else I'll be very, very quick with. The following extensive examination, the Library of Congress decided that this was an authentic 17th century printing. An outside opinion was sought from the forensic documents expert Walter C. McCrone, who asserted that he had, quote, a high degree of confidence in accepting the oath as a genuine 17th century printing. He had observed, quote, indications of old paper, old ink, and old printing, all of which are quite impossible to observe in more recently printed documents. Macrone's scientific tests were thought to prove this beyond doubt, and yet it took only moments for the book to raise the hackles of Nicholas Barker, surely the sharpest connoisseur of his generation. As soon as the oath surfaced, no less a figure than Bob Nikirk started sending Barker press clippings, keeping him abreast of events on this side of the pond. And when shown a photocopy of the document in 1986 by Arthur Freeman, Barker recalls having been, quote, disquieted by the appearance of the print, which did not look right. Though, quote, he could not immediately say why. How striking that Barker's language there is almost identical to Henry Bradshaw's 120 years earlier. When granted access to the document itself, the conclusions came quickly enough. You have bibliographical impossibilities like ascenders and descenders overlapping. The ornamental border is totally wrong. Lack of furniture, around the type just doesn't make any sense, and so on and on and on. The important lesson here is that, as Barker put it, all the equipment in the world will not reveal a fake if you do not know what to look for. Quite so. And of course, what I've come to think of as Barker's rule has a much broader application than merely the identification and study of forgeries. As yet another great Cambridge man, the poet and classicist A. Houseman put it, knowledge is good, method is good, but one thing beyond all others is necessary, and that is to have a head on your shoulders, not a pumpkin, and brains, not pudding, in your head. And eyes in your skull, one might add. How, then, to steer a course between the Scylla of empty technique and the Charybdis of subjective judgment? So far this evening, my mode has been diagnostic rather than prescriptive. I've tried to show the extent to which some of the most respected bibliographers of the last 160 years relied not solely on technique, but also on intuition. I've suggested that all of them understood intuition not to be an innate gift, but to be the product of cultivation and connoisseurship. I've cautioned against confusing instinct for evidence, on the one hand, and against placing too much faith in method on the other. If the eye can sometimes lead us astray, then so too can the microscope. Now, prescription does not come naturally to me. I'm neither a physician nor, heaven forbid, a priest. And the notion of lecturing members on the Grolier Club of how they ought to go about their business strikes me as absurd. Yet I fear I've talked myself into a dead end. I believe the central lesson of this evening's investigation is that instinct, if it is to rise beyond mere impressionism, must be cultivated. And so in what will be the final summing up part of this talk, I'm left with no option, I fear, but to consider how exactly we might go about this. It's easy enough to see how one might go about developing one's method. Read Bowers and Tansell, practice what they preach, go to the library, collate a book or 10, inspect watermarks, and, yes, to my shame, measure chain and wire lines. Identify the typefaces in which books are printed, scour for variants, stop press corrections, broken type. Examine the structures and materials of bindings. The cultivation of method is good in and of itself and can be its own reward. But the cultivation of instinct, of one's eye, it's far trickier to quantify. After much thought, I've distilled my own approach into 2 simple principles. And I share those with you this evening, not as ironclad rules, that would be absurd, but rather as prompts to what I have found to be a more fulfilling relationship with the study of books. The first of which, and it really is very simple, is 3 books a day. Doubtless there are some in this audience to whom that number will seem ludicrously small, and there are others for whom it looks unrealistically high. I've recently shared this principle with a young rising star of the antiquarian trade in London, for whom good books are in ample supply, who scoffed, "Is that all?" Well, of course, if you can handle more books than that every day, fantastic. But for those of us whose time, and let us be frank, budgets are limited, I would caution that spending an hour with 3 books is of infinitely greater value than spending the same time flitting across a dozen. The question of what 3 books? Well, that's up to you. The specialist in Italian incunables may not wish to spend much time with modern firsts, nor the collector of 20th century pulp with Renaissance play quartos. But, again, I would caution against taking too insular an approach. One never knows what may come in useful, and many of the greatest connoisseurs maintain general interests in a world that increasingly seems to value specialization. To pick a lone example, John Carter ranged effortlessly from 15th century editions of Catullus to modern detective fiction. Quote, "Even the chronicler of a living author is the better for having learned how to collate an incunable." That's how Carter put it. Well, perhaps it may be wise for a beginner to saturate him or herself in, say, only 18th century pamphlets. Eventually, it will be important to branch out and to expand the mental bank of comparison. To illustrate the importance of maintaining a broad frame of reference, I offer one final personal example. The last time I was in New York, almost precisely 2 years ago, I spent several deeply enjoyable days in the Morgan, looking at original manuscripts of Pope and Johnson. My habit when visiting any good library is always to factor in some downtime for looking at material that seems interesting, but of only tangential importance. I'd just finished writing my book about the Carter and Pollard inquiry and was, for various reasons, rather interested in 19th century facsimile printing. So I duly called up all their copies of the notoriously deceptive facsimile pamphlets printed by John Sturt in the 1590s, including his type facsimile of a single-sheet quarto pamphlet by Thomas Hayward. Reader, here you'll plainly see judgment perverted by these three, a priest, a judge, a patentee. So far as I know, the only title in English literature to take the form of a tetrameter triplet. Now, as soon as this book landed on my desk, I knew something was off. This is a 4-leaf pamphlet that's been bound as a separate, in very expensive feeling Niger Morocco, faded to a deep conker brown, but I suspect originally a shade of emerald green. The binding was signed by Riviere and Son, a firm renowned not only for its tasteful use of gilt, no guarantee in the age of Sangorski and Sutcliffe, but also for the exceptional quality of their restoration work. Now, as it happens, I've actually spent even more time with Riviere books while trawling through the Ashley Library in London than I have with Sturt facsimiles, and perhaps without knowing it, had come to appreciate their feel. The almost invisible paper repairs, rebuilt margins, swapped leaves, uniform toning throughout, heavy pressing that characterizes the ugly ducklings turned swans that emerged from their workshop in the first decades of the 20th century. And so when I lift the front board of the Morgan book, that's exactly what I see. In his quest for authenticity, Sturt habitually used old and often deeply textural 17th and 18th century paper, which can be enough to trap the unwary. But these pages had had all the guts washed out of them. They were sparkling clean, whereas Sturt facsimiles have been often artfully dirtied up. It was this immediate, palpable, overwhelming sense of cleanness that gave the game away. The book was not a faked-up facsimile, as the catalogue recorded, but a genuine 17th century book. In fact, only the third copy known in the US. Now, I like this example because it shows that the pendulum can swing in both directions. Sure, one occasionally is forced to downgrade supposedly 17th and 18th century books to the status of deceptive facsimile, a habit that I worry causes some librarians in London and Oxford to get sweaty palms when I walk up to the issue desk. But the very same tools that enable us to upgrade supposed forgeries to the status of unacknowledged originals, right? Like this. The key point here is that intuition is not merely a tool for debunking counterfeit printings, but for recognizing the fundamental character of a book. The animating question isn't, is this book good or bad? But rather, what kind of book is this? Okay, my second and last piece of counsel, which I hope is complementary to my first, is that one should learn to listen to one's intuition without allowing oneself to be swept along by the tide. Adopt a skeptical but generous attitude to one's impression of a book. When you handle a book, write down the first word that comes to mind. Reflect on why that word. There's always a danger that one's response to a book more closely reflects one's own history and preconceptions. And that's why it's important to consider through the evidence. When I handled that pamphlet in the Morgan, with words I jotted down, clean, flat, those are not necessarily the words that one associates with 17th century pamphlets. Indeed, one would probably be more likely to associate them with modern lithographic facsimiles, which is to say, there are many ways to explain an intuitive response. The key is to allow oneself to be guided by intuition, to take it seriously, but to consider all the options. Now, maintaining a broad frame of reference is an area in which I think antiquarian booksellers and library cataloguers enjoy considerable advantages over academics, who seldom escape the self-constructed shackles of micro-specialization. It is, I think, telling that Bradshaw, when trying to rationalize his instinctive confidence in the authenticity of the Codex Sinaiticus, compared himself to a humble tradesman who, quote, acquires the same sort of experience with regard to the quality of the particular goods which are daily passing through his hands. Precisely as booksellers do. It's a wonderfully demystifying statement, I think. And in the comments that I've made this evening, I've tried to draw on two aspects of it. Both Bradshaw's insistence on regularity, goods which are daily passing through his hands, and on tactility, goods which are daily passing through his hands. Both of these are, I think, crucial principles, though easy to forget in this age of digital facsimiles. If you take away only one thing from this evening, I hope it's this, that no quantity of learning, no amount of technique can substitute for real hands-on experience with books. In a characteristically wise essay on the forgery of printed documents, Nicholas Barker draws an arc between the, quote, curator's eye on the one hand and, quote, forensic evidence on the other. If the one sounds instantly suspect, then the other has extraordinary limitations. There is, he says, a very great deal more evidence which is not forensic, but it is nonetheless evidence. And I see this contrapposto between, quote, I see with my little eye, and my eye is better than yours, on the one hand, and on the other, quote, it fluoresces, therefore it must be wrong. There's a kind of balance of evidence, okay, a pendulum effect, Barker describes it as. What's crucial to us, I think, is that we understand the swing of that evidential pendulum, where it is, what that means. If we don't, then the danger is we find ourselves grasping at thin air. I began this evening's lecture with Henry Bradshaw, and it therefore seems appropriate to grant him the final word. Between 1872 and 1877, Bradshaw spent a good deal of time investigating early Welsh, Breton, and Cornish manuscripts. He closed his account of these investigations in the following way. Quote, far too much has been said of myself, but I can honestly say that it's been said solely in the hope that by seeing actually how I came to find one thing after another, others may be induced to start on similar exploring expeditions for themselves. The field is open to all, and a well-trained instinct is sure to find its own reward. Thank you for listening. I'll leave the great man up there to look down on us.
Any question?
Well, thank you for just a wonderful tour de force here. I wonder, as I was listening, whether you could almost characterize this as an Apollonian and Dionysian dichotomy between fact and feeling. The other comment I would like to make, speaking as a neurosurgeon, is that I would substitute the metaphor of the eye. I would use the nose, because I refer to this as the sniff test. And after evaluating fMRIs, functional MRIs, PET scans, and all of that, before I make a decision, it just has to seem right. And to me, that's a sniff test rather than the eye. But I won't quibble over which cranial nerve you use.
Thank you. You gave a tantalizing sort of discussion of the Siderius Nuncius controversy, but I didn't quite hear the explanation. Why do you think, was it Nick Wilding applying instinct rather than analysis, working only from photographs? Why he came up with the right answer when all these other scholars applying technical analysis didn't? I didn't quite understand what your conclusion was.
No, that's a very good point. So, to clarify, Nick's an astonishingly technically astute bibliographer whose work I admire deeply. What I was trying to convey there is that unthinking technical analysis can lead to wrong answers. and that if you can use all the tools of analytical bibliography to end up in a bad place. And so what I was trying to convey there is sometimes what seems like incredibly diligent scholarly work can be deeply wrong-headed. And the importance is to apply, to change my metaphor, a sniff test. And, you know, precisely, I think the same point holds with Nicholas Barker and you know, the Freeman, right? You've got Walter Macrone looking down his microscope saying, this is absolutely correct. And then you have Barker saying, but hang on a minute, it just looks wrong. And sometimes one has to step back and listen to that instinct. So it's, you know, as I sort of tried to convey at the end there, it's really not a one's better than the other at all. It's really that you've got to have both. Otherwise, you're going to end up saying some very silly things that you may wish you hadn't said, as we all have.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is quite fascinating. I just want to say that there is a contemporary parallel now with AI detection of fake photographs. I've seen one quite recently that passes AI detectors, but I'm 100% certain, because of my brain and knowledge, that it's a complete forgery. And I think you make the point so beautifully that it's the eye is connected to the brain, and technology can just do so much, and we have to rely on visual experience and context.
That's a really great point, and a deeply terrifying one. So you are absolutely correct. You know, the one can see that there's something just off about some of these images, right? But you know, I suppose the flip side that I would then say that the bibliographical material might sort of bring in is that one can end up in thinking things are incorrect that are correct at this point. And so having the balance of the eye and the technique, being able to, you know, actually deeply look at, to move from books to an image, to deeply understand what is going on in that collection of pixels, will be able to potentially confirm or refute one's initial reaction to an image. So yeah, I think there's going to be, I don't want to think about the next decade, but it's a really important point, and thank you for bringing it in.
I was thinking, when things are too perfect, I'm always looking for the flaw. Could you elaborate on that? Because that kind of helps pass the sniff test.
Yeah. Yes, that's a really an excellent point. I mean, flaws are kind of at the heart of bibliographical method, aren't they? You know, it's shoulder ink and slipped type, and you know, those kind of manufacturing clues are precisely what we're always looking for. And indeed, that's how one can distinguish, you know, an anachronistic printing method, or you know, such as in the case of these books printed with plates, like the Galileo and Oath examples, where the actual impression of the type is misshapen as though it has ink spread, rather than just the ink spread from the original impression of type. So, yeah, I mean, flaws are precisely what we look for as bibliographers, and the absence of them is always slightly worrying. But of course, that is also sometimes just evidence of books having been tampered with later on. Yes, so the washing and pressing, for instance, is something that I'm often, would be considered a flaw by many collectors now, but was considered restoration, 100 years ago. And those books do look deeply uncanny. There is something strange about leafing through an early 17th century book that looks as though it could have been fresh off the press, but is completely flat, and completely uniformly toned. Always a red flag in my book, but really fun, exciting stuff to look at. Thank you.
The correction of a flaw was exactly what Nick Wilding, one of his major points, to correct the broken portion of the Linnaean Society library stamp in the facsimile was what tipped him off in many ways.
Just for fun, I wonder if you'd extend your argument to the art world and art forgery, just for fun.
No. For the record. 2 reasons. One, I don't have a lawyer who's not my friend, and who would have to work gratis, and my pockets aren't deep enough. No, but in all seriousness, it's completely out of my comfort zone, and a couple of questions ago I said sometimes one can end up saying things deeply stupid, where one doesn't know of what one speaks. So I'll plead Wittgenstein's final aphorism there. But thank you for tempting me.
When you brought up the word connoisseurship, what brought to mind, and since art has been mentioned, that's why I'm saying this now. I've gone down the rabbit hole of YouTube and watching things, and I have discovered a wonderful program with Bandor Grosvenor about paintings. Yes. And the word connoisseurship, I think, is just what that program is about. And anybody who hasn't watched it, it's so much fun. It's
yes.
so much fun.
So it's a BBC series called Fake and Fortune has been going for 12, 13 seasons. Marvelous stuff. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hone. That was absolutely riveting this evening. Please join us for more conversation upstairs in the Morris Room, where we will be hosting Dr. Hone for drinks, and we will almost certainly have more questions for you upstairs if you can bear them. I have one final question myself, which is, what originally drew you to this kind of close analysis of books in the first place? Where did you at what point did you make that leap in your career and consciousness? And I'll hand him the mic to answer that.
Thank you, Declan. False imprints in early 18th century books drove me mad as a doctoral. I was doing my PhD on mostly sort of seditious printing in the early 18th century, and nearly everything of any interest refused to tell you who printed it, but there were often ornaments cropping up across similarly inclined books, and I rather thought that one could potentially work out who did what. I also rather like that these sorts of questions are soluble. One can walk around in circles talking about the meaning of the third line in a Keats stanza. But when it comes to what fount of type printed what book, you can work that out. And indeed you should. So I'll leave it with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.